Hello, I'm Mark Kortepeter, and I'm here to give an introduction to bioterrorism. My background is I'm a physician trained in infectious diseases and preventive medicine. I'm on the faculty at the Uniformed Services University and also the author of the book Inside the Hot Zone about my experiences working in biodefense. So here are some standard disclosures that these are really my opinions and not the opinions of any specific organization or the government. And I have no specific conflicts of interest to disclose. So why is this topic important? Well, I think that clinicians are on the front lines, and so the concern we have is that the first evidence of a bioterrorism event may be a sentinel person coming into a clinic or an emergency room for care. And so I think it's useful to have some kind of basic understanding of the possibility and what would be your part in recognizing this. In terms of recognizing, one of the big challenges is that when there is an event, how do you determine whether something's bioterrorism or just a naturally occurring disease outbreak? So a couple of things that you ought to be thinking about as potential clues are when you see unusually large numbers of acutely ill patients, and if they have an unusual clinical presentation, such as disease like anthrax or Yersinia pestis causing plague, there's often have more of a cutaneous presentation. But if you see a respiratory presentation, that ought to be considered a potential red flag. And then if you have a disease agent that's really not seen in your area or specific geographical area, typically that ought to be cause for concern, especially if it's spread by a vector and the vector is not present. And then if you happen to notice a strange distribution of cases, if you can understand where they were when they got exposed, such that it would follow a plume-like pattern, meaning a downwind spread of a disease, that could be cause for concern. And then finally, if there are dead animals at the same time that there are dead humans or ill humans, it's something to consider because animals often are susceptible to the same pathogens we are. And a good example is what happened in the first time there was an outbreak of West Nile virus in New York City, when there were dying pigeons and crows at the same time that humans were becoming ill. So this is the outline I'll be following. I'll start out with a scenario and go through other standard activities until ultimately get to response. So this is where I learned about bioterrorism and biowarfare. I was at the U.S. Army Medical Research Institute of Infectious Diseases, also known as USAMRIID, or affectionately we call it the hot zone. We were the hub for biodefense for the Army and really for the military at large, and working on countermeasures like diagnostics, treatments, and vaccines. And we had the specialized containment laboratories, biosafety level 3 and 4, to work on the various threat pathogens, even those that are the most highly deadly and highly difficult to work on in an enclosed environment, like Ebola, Marburg, anthrax, Yersinia pestis, etc. So, when I was there, I had multiple different roles, but at this time, back in October of 2001, many of you, of course, will recall 9/11 or September 11, 2001. Well, this was just 3 weeks later, and this was what I would call a near disaster. I was chief of medicine at the time, and around 2 o'clock in the morning, I received a phone call from my boss. He said, "I need you to pack and ship 150 doses of botulinum antitoxin to send to Japan emergently." Well, this certainly woke me up. As you're aware, botulinum toxin is one of the deadliest substances on the planet, and it makes an ideal assassination weapon, and it causes a descending flaccid paralysis and ultimately leads to restorative failure, which is what can lead to death. The key is, though, it usually occurs in just a couple cases linked to some kind of contaminated food. So if 150 people were intoxicated with botulinum toxin, that's a severe crisis, and it really certainly woke me up. So what did we do? Well, we spent all night packing 150 vials of botulinum antitoxin. We had to actually specific several different types of antitoxin at the time, and we were the only suppliers of that. And then around 7 o'clock in the morning, a police escort rushed me down to Andrews Air Force Base. And then, in the early wee hours of the morning, we finally learned exactly what was going on and who the presumed victims were. And it was President Bush and his cabinet members. And there was a presumed attack on the White House with botulinum toxin just before President Bush had headed out to an economic meeting in China. All went well, fortunately, but this is one of a couple times I've been then down at the White House, either as a consultant or to teach the White House medical staff about bioterrorism. So let's start from the beginning. What is biological warfare? It's just the intentional use of microorganisms or toxins derived from living organisms to produce death or disability in humans, animals, or plants. So the key is, although we worry about them primarily for human disease, they can also be used as weapons of economic warfare against animals or plants. And then if we transition then to terrorism, we're talking about the threat of use or use of these agents by individuals or groups motivated by some type of political, religious, ecological, or other ideological objective. So the use of pathogens to cause disease in humans has a long and sort of checkered history dating back centuries. And there's some very notable ones. I can't go into all of these, but back in the Middle Ages, where the adversaries laid siege to the city of Kaffa in Crimea and launched corpses of individuals who died of bubonic plague over the city walls using catapults. And then subsequently, there were cases inside the city walls, causing the defenders to flee the city. In the French and Indian War, the British used smallpox, contaminated blankets, and handkerchiefs, and gave them as gifts to the Indians sympathetic to the French to cause disease amongst them. And there are multiple other cases that are listed throughout history, all the way up to the use of a more modern technique in the 2001 outbreak using anthrax contaminated letters to cause illness in various targets in the media and in politics. So, over the years, though, really in the 20th century is when the use of biological pathogens became really highly sophisticated in the great superpowers when they developed their own programs to develop biological weapons. And so this is an example from Iraq in their 1995 disclosures, what they had produced and weaponized prior to destruction by the UNSCOM, the allies who went in there and ended up destroying all their pathogens. Another example is what the Soviets had done. They had a very sophisticated multi-million-dollar program to develop ton quantities of pathogens. They had a specific desire to work on diseases that were communicable person to person. So you can see smallpox and plague ranked at the top of their list. And they had a way that they would rank these in terms of a scoring system. Now, many of you may know, but some of you may not know that the US also had its own biological warfare program to develop weapons starting in the 1940s. This was concluded in 1969 by President Nixon when he wanted us to get out of the offensive business. And then, we've had a defensive program since the 50s, which continues to this day. But, you can see here the pathogens we were developing, things like Bacillus anthracis causing anthrax, botulinum toxins, Francisella tularensis causing tularemia. And you can also see we had an interest in anti-crop weapons as well. The key thing that you should be noticing, though, when you look at these different major programs, there's a lot of similarity in terms of the pathogens they were developing. Things like, again, causing tularemia, anthrax, botulinum toxin, Venezuelan equine encephalitis, et cetera. And there's a reason for that. And I'll get into that in a little bit. Of course, what we are concerned about is that even though we are aware of what was going on in these previous programs, we are still concerned that other countries have programs that are ongoing. And, we of course know what Iraq and Soviet Union were doing, but now of course Russia is a little bit of a black box. And then we have concern about other countries like China, Iran, and North Korea. And so when I talk about the different pathogens and what's on the lists, I think you have to think about a couple different aspects that makes a pathogen, good for a weapon. So, and why there are these similarities. So one is you can look at historical devastation. We know some of these diseases, smallpox, for example, anthrax, plague had, severe devastation over centuries. Look at how well these are infectious. Do they infect everybody who gets exposed? And then if they are infected, are the majority of individuals developing disease of those who are infected? So the disease to infection ratio. And then if someone's interested in causing death, what's the case fatality ratio? And then, as I mentioned with the Soviets, if they're interested in diseases that spread person to person, communicability is maybe an attractive feature. And then when you talk about deploying these, then something like stability is very key, whether the organism is stable in the environment, how easy is it to produce, and then if you're going to deploy it, does the adversary or the population have specific countermeasures they can apply? So if a terrorist is interested in using some pathogens as weapons or some type of weapon, what would they do? Why would they reach for a biological versus some of the other types of weapons they might be able to reach for? So there may, it's kind of easy, I guess, to say what might be the objectives in a warfare scenario when, the adversary is trying to win a battle or something like that. But what are the terrorism objectives? And this is a little more difficult to try to understand, whether someone might be just looking for publicity, to cause confusion or panic, death or disability, or do they just want to overwhelm the healthcare facilities? Are they looking for some financial objective or disruption of commerce? The bottom line is we don't know exactly, we can't get in their minds. And this in some ways makes it even more difficult to defend against. So why does someone then reach for bioweapon as a potential weapon for terrorism? So for a couple of reasons, these may be why they are attractive. One is they're easy to obtain, depending on what the agent is. They're relatively easy and inexpensive to produce. If someone knows some basic microbiology, they can be readily available to be spread in various delivery modes. They do have the capability to disseminate over large areas without detection. So if someone's after a population center or even on the battlefield, those are two large areas that could be potentially a weapon could be deployed. There are lots of casualties who could be inflicted and potentially overwhelming the medical system. And for some of these that do have this sort of historical devastation awareness, then even the threat of use could potentially create fear or panic in the population. And then because one thing that's unique about biological weapons versus chemical, nuclear, or conventional is that they have an incubation period. So if someone deploys a pathogen, then there's some time for this incubation period, sometimes days, sometimes weeks, before the illnesses become manifest, such that the perpetrator can escape before the effects are seen. So as I mentioned, these are readily available. So what are some of the potential sources? Well, the natural environment, there are legitimate suppliers all around the world. Someone could steal pathogens, and then they could produce them themselves. And then they could purchase these from some clandestine secret source, and then otherwise, who knows, wherever they might be able to get them. This is just an example of that. This is Larry Wayne Harris, 1998, when he was arrested in Las Vegas, but he was actually arrested in 1995, got a lot of fanfare at the time in the media, and that was because he had Yersinia pestis in his glove compartment of his car, which he had obtained legitimately. Well, you could say he obtained it from a legitimate source, and this is the source he got it from, the American Type Culture Collection at the time. And what happened was there was nothing against holding various pathogens. The problem was what he had done is in his application to receive this pathogen, he had lied on the paperwork, And so he was actually convicted for mail fraud as a result. But this is just an example. There are legitimate culture collections that produce and ship these various pathogens all around the world. And of course, the rules have been tightened actually ever since Larry Wynn Harris, such that at least the CDC then now you have to be registered with them to be able to get pathogens and have a legitimate reason. But there are hundreds of these types of culture collections around the world. One of the other things about bioweapons that make them potentially attractive to a terrorist is that they require really the common technology needed for legitimate production of things like beer and wine, vaccines, pharmaceutical products. And therefore they can potentially be hidden in plain sight, as it were. So they can be, produced within regular microbiology labs, pharmaceutical companies, beverage production. And so this dual use technology really is challenging. And in fact, the former Soviet program had half of their program within the pharmaceutical industry within the Soviet Union as part of those, sort of a hidden program. And then the other thing is, even in the U.S. offensive program, it's no surprise that they tapped pharmaceutical companies to assist. In fact, George Merck, the director of Merck Vaccine and Merck Corporation back in the 40s, 50s, was actually the head of the program when it first started in the United States. So the other thing, as I mentioned, was low cost. So when this was an assessment done years ago by a UN panel, just comparing the cost to produce, mass casualties in a square kilometer by weapon type, you can see so conventional, nuclear, chemical, all were far more expensive than a biological pathogen. And so, obviously the numbers are different now with inflation, and then you multiply this large by how many square kilometers you're going to affect, the numbers will be greater. But here again, the idea is the proportional difference between biological, much cheaper than the other types of weapons. And this is also a historical assessment looking at a hypothetical dissemination by airplane of 50 kilograms of agent along a 2-kilometer upwind of a population center of 500,000 people. This was a study assessed in the UK. And you could see the various pathogens they assessed. Well, basically, tularemia and anthrax were at the head of the class there with over 20 kilometers downwind spread, and you can see the most dead and incapacitated. Here again, it's no surprise why some of these different disease agents, anthrax, tularemia, Q fever, ended up at the top of the lists for these biological weapons programs. So this is a newer assessment done a contract for the U.S. Army, where they looked at what is the sort of the lethal footprint for various pathogens. And you can see here, anthrax compared to plague, ricin, and bot toxin A, much greater percentage of individuals who would be, have high, percentage higher lethality, over 90% in the red. And then you can see the downwind plume of anthrax. We're talking out to 140 kilometers. So that's quite a distribution over a space. So there are multiple different portals of entry, respiratory, gastrointestinal tract, and skin and mucous membranes. The respiratory tract is by far and away, if someone is actually trying to infect a lot of people, that's the most efficient way. Gastrointestinal tract, the closer someone gets to the end user, such as at a salad bar or such as in, a drinking source directly close to that individual, that they have much higher percentage of individuals who'd be infected. If someone tries to contaminate a reservoir, well, there's the dilutional effect, potentially, chlorination, potentially filtration that might reduce the number of ill from, some type of attack like that. And then skin and mucous membranes, by and large, these have to be up very close to the person, and potentially someone has the skin is a very good barrier, so you'd have to penetrate the skin with some type of sharp instrument, much as what was used in Vietnam with something like a punji stick, where you have feces coated on a sharp stake, and then that goes through the boot, cause a very suppurative infection. So because inhalation and through the respiratory route is the most difficult to defend against, and it's probably the most optimal for delivering against a large population. So the key is the particle size matters. So the maximal infection of the human lung for a particle would be somewhere between 1 and 5 micron size particle. So these get down in the lower respiratory tract past the mucociliary blanket, and it's not detectable by our senses. If you have something a little larger than that, the body's own, clearance to the nose, the cilia, and the mucus along the respiratory tract will help clear that out. If something smaller, it acts more like a gas, so it's inhaled then exhaled. Explosive munitions are not as effective as a spray device for delivery, and that's partly because the heat and the light of the explosion will inactivate a significant amount of the agent. It doesn't mean they aren't somewhat effective, but not certainly as efficient as something like a spray device. And they don't produce the uniform size particles with an explosion in the 1 to 5 micron size. So as an example, just to go back here, as an example, you can see here a picture of a crop duster. So various crop dusters can be configured to release a particle size of 1 to 5 microns, which is why here again, this could be very challenging to defend against, cause lots of illness. So, when we think about threat of bioterrorism, what's the highest threat? The highest threat is something dispersed in aerosol that's highly lethal. Someone has production capability and they know how to actually produce something in large quantities. There's lack of treatment or vaccine, and it is potentially communicable. So it's sort of like the gift that keeps on giving. You start the flame, light the fire, and then it keeps going. And then finally, the mere threat of something, of course, of concern, especially with historical devastation, may cause some concern and panic in the population. So, I've said, okay, these maybe make the ultimate weapon. I should mention here that, bioweapons and the deployment of them is not necessarily so simple as I've said. So number one, if someone is a small scale, not so hard, but if someone wants to do something in large scale production, that takes a lot of knowledge and sophistication equipment. And then it becomes an engineering feat to some degree to get particle sizes uniform, et cetera, to such that it could be deployed across the population. Secondly, if someone is looking to deploy something, it's highly weather dependent. It has to have the right ideal conditions, which are really, nighttime, an inversion, a low level wind such that the aerosol doesn't get dispersed. Because if you don't have that, essentially the aerosol will just go straight up into the atmosphere and would not affect anybody. So as a result of this, use of bioweapons are somewhat unpredictable, which is what makes them in some ways less desirable. And so, as I mentioned here, in the next bullet, if a commander in a field environment is told, hey, I want you to take a specific objective, take that hill for the forces, well, they're not really ideal for a rapid need, such as on the battlefield. They would be more used as strategic weapons to hit various communication nodes or supply nodes, et cetera. And therefore, similarly, for terrorism, if someone's trying to do an on-time, on-target type of objective, it's not going to work for that. And then finally, some of these actually have countermeasures. We certainly need more countermeasures, but some of these do have countermeasures which are effective, such that someone does deploy these, we do have some way to at least protect the population or treat them if they become ill. So in terms of countering bioterrorism, there are lots of different aspects that need to be integrated. First of all is intelligence, knowing who's out there, who's got what, who's got a specific beef about something that would cause them to use a bioweapon, and then having a good disease surveillance to detect when there are those sentinel cases coming in for care. Education and training, essentially what we're doing right here, so giving some basic knowledge about these diseases, and I understand you'll have more lectures on specific pathogens. Medical countermeasures, of course, are important. Vaccines, prophylaxis, et cetera. Having good diagnostics. So there's obviously more research that needs to be done to develop some of the countermeasures against these diseases for which we have either not optimal countermeasures or we could use some in general. And then finally, physical countermeasures. Certainly detection is useful. And there is physical protection that does work if someone's wearing something to protect their airway, a mask or some type of gas masks for the military. There is protection that can be afforded. The challenge, of course, with a bioweapon attack is if you don't know when it's going to occur, you wouldn't know when to don your protective measures. So it's probably less useful in that situation. It might be useful if there are risk of secondary aerosols or something like that. But otherwise, physical protection takes a lesser importance for bioweapons. So in terms of some of the other development of countermeasures, so these are what's called the CDC Category A threat agents or diseases. So the CDC came up with 3 different categories, A, B, and C. A was determined to be the highest threat diseases. You could see it's no surprise that it's the same names that you're seeing in the old bioweapons programs for the major military forces in the major countries around the globe. So anthrax, botulism, plague, tularemia, viral hemorrhagic fevers like Ebola, Marburg, Lassa, and then finally smallpox. Here again, many of these are known for historic devastation across populations across the world. I affectionately call these the chessmen of doom in some of my writings. And why do I say that? What I wanted to do when I was writing about this was to give them sort of each of them a face or something that's easily recognized for the population, the lay population, as well as the medical population. And so, for example, here, anthrax, I call the queen. Why? The queen is the most powerful piece on the chessboard, can travel in any direction across the entire board. And so then if you think about anthrax, it's highly deadly. It can spread long distances downwind, very much like it's almost like the ideal biological weapon, similar to that queen on the chessboard, which is all powerful. So looking ahead, I have concern obviously still about various actors around the world, whether it's Iran or North Korea. Interestingly, this is a picture of the Korean leader next to what is a new production plant for pharmaceuticals, supposedly, but this could easily just be a production plant as well for some kind of biological weapon agent. As I said, there's this dual use technology that makes these hard to sort of assess and track down. The other thing to think about is, we are in a new era. In the early 20th century, we had the improvements in microbiology and the sophistication in the old bioweapons programs. Now we're in a new sophisticated era of molecular biology. And so, various pathogens can be made de novo. We've seen how these various different diseases have been made. So now you tie this in, the synthetic biology advances, now with something like additive manufacturing, 3D printing, be able to make things very easily anywhere. And then you tie that in with drone technology, you can have various things deployed, very small footprint of deployment, much harder to counteract and really defend against. So in summary, biological weapons are a very real threat to the military forces, as well as a potentially potent terrorist weapon against civilian targets. Mass casualties could be produced if they have the wherewithal and technology to produce large numbers and have something that's actually stable in the environment. There are medical defenses against some of these agents for countermeasures, and then early recognition and response is key to reducing illness. And this is really where all of you come in terms of being able to recognize those early cases and get a response quickly. And then so, think about this in the back of your mind, suspecting a biological attack in a setting where you're seeing mass casualties, especially with a similar clinical syndrome, especially if that syndrome is somewhat unusual. So I will conclude there, and I will just say thank you for attention. And if you need to reach me or would like to contact me, there's my contact information and email, as well as my website. I'm on Twitter as well as LinkedIn. Thank you for your attention.